Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday program. I'm Georgia Kelly, the Director of Praxis. Today we are thrilled to host a true Renaissance man. Michael Murphy was the co-founder and visionary leader behind Esalen Institute in Big Sur. Today, 65 years after its founding, Esalen continues to be a thriving source of mind-body education and healing. Ever the innovator, Michael organized Esalen's unique Soviet-American exchange program in the 1980s, which was a form of citizen-to-citizen diplomacy that brought groups of Soviet scientists to the US and to Esalen. Michael is the author of several books, including the best-selling Goff in the Kingdom, which was made into a documentary. Jacob Adabet was another novel, and The Future of the Body, a cross-cultural collection of documented occurrences of extraordinary human abilities, which include yoga techniques, telepathy, clairvoyance, and other so-called superhuman capabilities. Michael is one of the movers and shakers of both the 20th and the 21st centuries, really a true Renaissance man. So welcome, Mike. It's great to have you with us today.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction.
Oh, you
Thank
deserve more,
you.
but I didn't want to take up too much time. So I'm going to begin with where your awakening started. And that is back when you wandered into that philosophy class at Stanford. And what this has meant to the rest of your life. That supposedly that was a mistake, but it seems like it was a direction. So how did that experience set the trajectory for the rest of your life's work? Because it seems like it did. What happened that day, and how did it change the course of your life?
Well, it indeed was uh, a coincidence. You can call it an accident. I was in my second year at Stanford. I was a sophomore, and it was the class I was attending. I was flipped to another class because the professor, Frederick Spiegelberg. I've told this story so often, Georgia. Maybe some of you sitting there have heard it, but in any case, um, I I didn't know they were changing the venue of the class until I walked in, and I'd heard about him, and he there was a reputation around the campus that he'd been to India and had some amazing stories to tell. I had seen The Razor's Edge with Tyrone Power, if you remember that. This is a long time ago. I mean, this is, wow, this is 1950. So this was 75 years ago. And so I decided to stay there. And I heard from somebody sitting in the back of this Coverly Auditorium, there were about, we could seat about, I don't know, but maybe 600 people. So this was a group of typically restless Stanford students at 1:30. That was a restless moment after lunch, or some of them actually ready to doze off. It was it's not a good moment then to start a lecture. But in any case, somebody next to me said, well, he's lecturing on the earliest scriptures. It was a course on comparative religions, and he was lecturing on the Upanishads and the Rig Veda. So a kind of a reasonably, an ordinarily semi-restless crowd. But when he walked in, his presence was so extraordinary that the place quieted right down. And he held the silence for a moment. And then one word, Brahman, the omnipresent reality, Brahman. And he literally, he had the class with that first word. And he lectured for 45 minutes about the earliest metaphysical ideas in the great period of the birth of the Upanishads in India. That would be around somewhere between 600 and 800 years BC. Then he ended the lecture with Atman. Brahman is Atman. Brahman, the omnipresent reality, is one with Atman, our deepest subjectivity, our eternal subjectivity. It's you got to be careful translating that word. You can call it soul or self with a capital S, but it loses something in translation. But to think of it as your deepest and eternal sense of identity is one with Brahman. In any case, when I walked out of there, back up to my fraternity, there on the campus, one sentence just kept going through my mind. One sentence. You're never going to be the same. You're never going to be the same. It really skewered me. The set of ideas, the way he presented it. Now, I'd basically been a religious kid. My family was not a church-going family, but I had ended up being an altar boy in the Episcopal Church starting when I was 11. Okay. And I had been a religious semi-oddball in our extended family in Salinas, California there. But nevertheless, when I got to Stanford, I went through a lot of the usual first wave of, let's call it debunking and not believing anything. I had a good dose of it these first 2 years at Stanford. So this was the end of my second year. But in any case, walking back up the fraternity, I had that feeling. And so I stayed in that class and was led through it by Spiegelberg through the different religions. It was a classical course, particularly as it was developing in Europe, of looking at all the world religions in a single purview, finding connections between them, highlighting their great moments, challenging everybody in the class with to compare this one metaphysical assumption to another, one range of experience to another. It was a very rich program. And I went home that summer and it knocked me off my course. I was in Stanford to be in pre-med in the family. I'd been assigned the role of being a doctor like my grandfather. And now I'm 19, then I turned 20. Well, to make a long story short, I fell completely into the openings that happened in that first quarter. Now we could go into that, but that's how it started. But it was also, Georgia, just to make it sufficiently complete to start our talk, that course ended with the work of the great Indian philosopher and who'd been a great political leader before Gandhi, Aurobindo Ghosh, Sri Aurobindo, who saw the world, the whole world, the cosmos, as an evolution of its implicit divinity. You could say his whole metaphysics was pretty close to German idealism. Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Schelling's whole dictum that this existence of ours that we all live in is the Deus implicitus, evolving, however fitfully or painfully or with meanders and whatever, always pushing toward the Deus explicitus. And that our ethic, our practice, our greater possibilities were to fall into this great evolutionary adventure, which we all share, whether we recognize it or not, no matter how we talk about it, but we're rooted in that. This is the basic thinking. So that course in that sophomore year ended with the work of Sri Aurobindo. So when I went home that summer, I took his big book, and this started me on the voyage. I came back for the fall, for the third year at Stanford, and got into his course on Indian philosophy. And one thing led to another. I dropped out of pre-med. I dropped out of my fraternity. It was a shock to my family. As my father said, son, if only you could have been anything else but a yogi. That was Salinas, 1850. If any of you have read any of Steinbeck's books, I mean, it was a tough town, really. And a yogi, wow. So anyway, that's how the adventure started.
Well, that brings me to two other things that I have on my list, actually. And one was for you to talk about your experience at Sri Aurobindo's ashram in India. Because one thing I found very interesting about Aurobindo, because I've studied a lot of Indian philosophy too, as you probably know, is that he was very spiritual, obviously, but also he was political. He was really worldly and spiritual in a very interesting combination that very few of the yogis are. And if you have anything you want to say about that, I'd really be interested in hearing about that, as well as how your experience at the ashram, because I know you were there for about a year and a half, how
Yeah.
that shaped the rest of your life.
Well, it was by the time I went there, I was then 25, and I had taken a brief run at graduate school in philosophy, and I saw that it just wasn't my place to be because at that time there was really a coup de grace happening in the philosophy department at Stanford and really all over America and Europe, certainly in many universities, of analytic philosophy, reductive thinking, and kind of the opposite. It was a headwind for me, and have professors there saying they knew I was lit up with this vision, and I was practicing meditation hours every day, and it came easy to me, and it was so deeply, deeply pleasurable. I was lucky. I had a natural aptitude from the beginning. They knew it, and they wanted to inform me that when a mystic or a philosopher says he sees God or knows God or Brahman or Atman, it's just his way of saying he feels good. I mean, it was kind of the art of dismissal lifted to a very elegant, nice, a benevolent seeming attitude that a young man, it's time to grow up. I mean, this is your romantic period, but at some time here, you're going to have to grow up, and this is a nasty world. And it's your duty as a philosopher to be depressed, at least partly depressed, and to have a mastery of skepticism. And some of these characters then, I remember, mastered the art of very subtle sneering at bad ideas, a kind of curl of the lip, and some of them very attractive guys. These are all men in the faculty at Stanford in philosophy. And anyway, but yeah, if just don't tell us you are seeing Brahman or Atman, just say you feel good. Well, okay, everything was the art of reduction. Anyway, so I went to the Aurobindo ashram and spent a year and a half, and it really enabled me to anchor my practice once and for all. And it appealed to me, Georgia, in large part because of his idea that this is world embracing. And that was my inclination, not to go off into a cave and go into a permanent samadhi, but to enter the world. And Aurobindo's basic ethic was to bring the Deus implicitus out into the world and into a framework of activity and thinking that was adequate to the challenge. He'd been educated in England. He came from a kind of the Indian elite of the day. His father was a very well-known doctor who really made a difference in Bengal in the as a young doctor, and had sent three of his sons to be educated in England. So Aurobindo spent from the time he was 7 till 21 in elite schools in England. And he had some acquaintance, a really good acquaintance with 12 languages, and he got these monumentally high scores in Greek and Latin. And then went to Cambridge. He was at King's College at Cambridge. Anyway, he came back to India and finding his way, and found his way into the leadership of the Indian Nationalist Party, which came before the Congress Party. And it was the first party that said we have to go beyond accommodation with the British Empire and be independent. He was a leader of the independence movement. He spent a year in jail over all this. This is before Gandhi. And then he, okay, this would be another story to tell, George. We don't maybe have time today for this, but he had a natural opening into a big transformation of consciousness, which he's written a lot about. He lived his life as a writer. I mean, 31 books and 35 books, and including a lot of poetry. But he was an electrifying leader between 1908 and 1910. And he was in jail here. And anyway, when he was acquitted for his so-called crimes, started to publish again, got married, didn't have any children, but was going to be arrested again, and this time deported because of what he was doing and the threat he had become. To have a mind like this. And actually, he had gotten to know some of the leading characters in the British Raj running India in those days. And, there was quite a thing to be assigned into these big jobs in India. Anyway, if you've read any of the literature or seen any of the shows and the dramas, Forster, anyway, Passage to India or whatever, this was a glossy high life. But they were not ready by any means to start talking independence with England. It was the jewel in the crown. Some of you may have seen that great TV series, but in any case, so he, knowing they were after him, escaped to the French enclave down in the south of India, the Pondicherry. Sometimes it's said to be Puducherry now trying to update or conform the English terms to some sort of Indian form. But anyway, Pondicherry, and there he lived the rest of his life and flowered really as a deeply realized mystic and then author, and then built this ashram. And so that's where I went when I was 25. And got myself anchored in a way. And within me, it was a kind of formidable combination of high metaphysics with this realization that what I was experiencing was a lot more than just feeling good. it carries with it a profound knowing, the kind of knowing that it comes in all the traditions, given different names, but is once you start to have that, it's hard to not get knocked off your pins. I mean, and that from then on, when when I had to run the gauntlet, as I did as a, in the philosophy department there, with those couple of quarters, I could return their sneer with my sneer. I mean, I could answer, I really could, their assertions with mine. And of course, in that whole enterprise, building up a way forward, I don't want to elaborate this, but turning to people like William James, the varieties of religious experience, his radical empiricism. So I'd become a radical empiricist by that time, arguing that the worlds we explore in the contemplative life, the yogic life, whatever practices, or if it comes spontaneously, or however it blossoms in us, is empirically based in the sense that direct experience, which can be either inhibited or facilitated. It can go either way by how we think about it. So it raises a challenge of thought. And then, of course, then the great philosophic issues arise. And, why are we doing this to ourselves, this crazy world we live in? Why, if this is the secret of the divine, why this? Okay. And that's been, obviously at the heart of Esalen now for 65 years. People come there. We were down there. Dulcie Murphy, my wife, who I see now right on this broadcast, she could wave to us there. Anyway, we were down there last weekend, and the place has never been more alive than it is now. People are coming from all over the world down there, and it's a bastion of experience that's forming. It's kind of coalescing without a single banner, but simply as a sensibility. This is something we could talk about today. There's a big rumble in the hood. I want to tell you that. And it's worldwide. It really is. And that's what I'm up to, is facilitating the rumble.
I like that rumble in the hood. There's so many places I could go with this, and I'm kind of scrapping some of my questions or pulling them together in a way, because I want to go back to something you said that I think we've all been affected by, and that is the debunking, the push toward being practical, whatever the society or the culture deems practical at a particular point in time. And what you just talked about, the art of dismissal. I know we have all been subjected to that from really our earliest age. And I think probably some people on this call, myself included, remember when we had abilities that we learned to not talk about, and then in many cases lost. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about how the culture pushes us into this narrow space, and what ways you have found to get past this, to break out of it, to get past the, how we deprogram from this kind of cultural straitjacket. Any ideas on that?
Okay, well, that's a big one, obviously.
I know.
Well, there are three sides to it that that Esalen addresses. First, transformative practices, meditation, the so-called somatic practices, all the body disciplines that that Esalen is known for. Things like Rolfing, Feldenkrais, all these methods. I'm sure some of you listening know about all that, and many others practices to open the doors of perception and feeling, and the practice of relationship that's nurturing, and etc. That's the I would say the deepest keel in the water of the good ship Esalen. But also the ideas about it all. So, we have this dictum down there that we've always no one captures the flag, because we've learned, boy, have we learned it again and again. When you attract a large circle of idealistic and socially active and thinking people, you're going to have a lot of fights about which activity, which approach, which idea is the most important. It's a feisty community. All right. But part of our vision in starting the place was to embrace science all the way down to its roots, that we're exploring into God, as it were, as some theologians have put it. We're exploring into our greater life. And the foundational idea is this greater life, this Deus implicitus, is pressing to be born in us, and it often comes out in ways that we don't fully understand. So all of that thinking. Now, we started in 1962, and there had been this tremendous amount of writing after World War II, a lot of it in reaction against the Holocaust and all, by people like Theodor Adorno and the studies of the authoritarian personality, Wilhelm Reich. I could go on and on and on. And I was steeped in that literature as well. It's as if we were, all of us, having to wrestle one way or another with a limiting conformity and kind of breaking out into something new. And some of the leaders of that thinking came to our very first programs at Esalen. Abraham Maslow, who actually drove into the place before our program started on a dark night and found the staff reading his latest book, Toward a Psychology of Being, which I had passed out to the staff. And I took it as an omen from beyond, a Jungian synchronicity, that there he was, and we became very, very close. And Aldous Huxley, who had been now writing about this and getting the idea of human potentialities. He had a big influence in us in those years. And Paul Tillich, who was, you could argue, certainly the most eminent Protestant Christian theologian, certainly one of the most, and certainly in our line of thinking, completely sympathetic. I mean, he became a friend. He had been a close friend with Spiegelberg, my professor at Stanford. So and then we even signed a big contract with the National Council of Churches to have different theologians come down there, have these programs, and then try to interpret them from a Christian viewpoint. But of course, we had a more immediate influence in those first years, more from Eastern philosophies. Alan Watts, whom I had known when we started Esalen, and all sorts of people like Huxley, like Alan Watts, like the Vedanta Society, etc. So there was a big meeting of East and West, but these were different viewpoints, different formulations, different theories, different interpretive frameworks to come into relation with this spectrum of transformative practices. So there's a marriage of practice and theory, but without falling in to a cult or into an anchored viewpoint. And Sam King, you were friends with Sam. That's how Sam came to us, through that whole thing with the National Council of Churches. And he was a young, dazzling young, really theologian in the making. And he had, he was as good looking as any Hollywood actor, so that helped. And his word to go forth. But in any case, But the third leg of, you could say, the stool we sat on and still do, is to enact it in the social life of our times, which, we could talk about. I'm looking at Dulcie right here on my screen, and she's been head of her own institute, track two, meaning non-governmental government relations. And our big long-term program with Russia. And, the meeting of Russia and America was part of it. And the other big part of the program was in Israel and peace between the Palestinians and the Israeli Jews. And we had groups now from both Russians. We had all these meetings going on at Esalen. And so that was probably our most fully invested, the most money we spent, the most people we gathered in terms of social action in those efforts to bring these countries together. So back to the structure of Esalen. So there was the transformative practices, the interpretive frameworks, and the social action. All right, and then how to make a creative mix. So we set a pretty high aspiration for ourselves, and it's a miracle we didn't all end up in jail, because in the 60s it got pretty wild, and the music scene there, if any of you have seen this Bob Dylan movie, I mean, Joan Baez and that whole gang, Arlo Guthrie and the characters in that movie, that recent movie, that was very much involved down there at Esalen. And but it was part of that eruption of the 60s, the counterculture against the war in Vietnam, etc. Dan Ellsberg became our friends, and early on, way back in the very beginning, and etc. So that's how that's how my life unfolded briefly here, and how Esalen was dreamt up and what it's worked to do, to keep it an open system, but not promiscuous, but open to what is trying to emerge in us. It's amazing the scale of the demographic involved in this. And I really do believe, Georgia, that no historian, sociologist, anthropologist has yet captured it in its fullness. There are books about, the spiritual but not religious and so forth, but to capture it in its fullness and nuance and its spread, I mean, this rumble in the hood.
I love that's the title of your next book, Mike.
Well, anyway, so, but it's a work in progress, and but it's nothing can get into the headlines these days past Trump. But anyway, it's happening there.
This is really exciting. I mean, I love hearing your stories and hearing about all this. Many things came to mind as we were talking. And, one of the things I think of is, Mike, you should be a professor. I mean, the way you explain things, the engagement that people have with it, and you're so articulate and so clear. Of course, this is also amazing because, and I'm sure you don't mind, I mean, you are 94 and a half, I think, and are so cogent and together, physically and mentally. It's an inspiration, I think, to all of us. And there are a few things that came out. We've been talking about all these men who are teachers. So I want to bring up one of the women who was involved, and that was the mother who worked with Aurobindo.
Yeah.
And because I think she was a very important figure in terms of getting the ashram started. And she was French. Very interesting thing about her, because I have a couple of books by her. And in one of them, she is teaching the reader how to develop clairvoyance, a step-by-step sort of plan on how to do it. And I started doing it, years ago, 30 years ago or so, and it was working. And I thought, wow, to be able to put this in a step-by-step process and relearn what you probably knew at 3 was phenomenal. And before I open it up to questions, I just want to know if you have anything to say about the mother.
Yeah. Well, Aldous Huxley had been writing about that, and he was front and center in a lot of things, and had written. He came out of that British intellectual royalty. I mean, his um, great uncle Thomas Huxley, I mean, was the warrior with Charles Darwin. And then on the other side, Matthew Arnold, I mean, one of the greatest critics in British literary history. And then he wrote Brave New World and much else. Then came over here, and then with the Vedanta Society down in LA with Gerald Hurd, his great, wildly Irish companion there, and the Christopher Isherwood, and then quite a little group down there in LA, and Igor Stravinsky, and it was quite a group. So Huxley, was writing essays just like that, what you said about the mother, teaching what he proposed that what the Western university system had to adopt were the nonverbal humanities. And not only talking about, but entering into these extra dimensional capacities that we have. We pay, let's say, in the standard curricula of all the universities, we honor imagination. We honor, at least if you get into a poetry class, Coleridge, talking about the difference between fantasy, and true imagination that can reach out. People don't realize what a mystic Coleridge was, but as was Wordsworth, really. But clairvoyance was an item. But God forbid, in a class at Stanford, and you start talking like this, it's like the Dean of Min talked to me once because they were trying to get rid of Spiegelberg from Stanford, some of the faculty, and my father had even threatened to sue Stanford and to sue Spiegelberg for derailing me and turning me into a yogi thing they could think of. Later, they become our generous supporters. We wouldn't have Esalen without my family, and starting with my father. But in those first years, he had to get over the shock of sending his son to Stanford, and then he comes out a yogi. But in any case, I would say modern academia flirts with some of this sometimes, some teachers. But Huxley and others in those early years of Esalen certainly were writing about it and practicing. And actually, I had my first LSD trip was with Huxley and his wife, Laura, the first year that Esalen started. I only had 8 trips, but between 62 and 66, it didn't turn out to be my ally, but we've always supported it and tried to lift it, to nurture it in its best form. And it's coming back now. There's a true renaissance, and it's gotten anchored to some extent at Johns Hopkins and other universities, and at Harvard to some extent, more than is generally known. But anyway, all of that practicing. So your thing with the mother, you really can. You can learn to cultivate clairvoyance, seeing at a distance. And I must tell you, we don't have time to talk about it today, but I've had this huge involvement in the world of sport. Writing that first book, Golf in the Kingdom. It's all over the sport world, all over, but hiding in plain sight because the trainers and the coaches, when they have a super athlete, and certainly in the NFL and the NBA, and you have these athletes in the baseball world, I mean, and they see things and do things that we marvel at, but the story of how it happened and what else might happen, typically doesn't get told.
Right.
So they taught me out because I wrote that book and also other books, and to kind of talk to these athletes about it. And it's become a kind of unpaid occupation for me, a rabid sports fan. I get to go to these games and talk to the athletes who do these crazy things. It's so clairvoyant. Well, you'd be amazed at the stories. I've written some books about it, and I'm going to be doing some more writing about it all. It's one of the great untold stories of our culture, the degree and depth and scale and variety of religious. It's like William James, oh God, he'd have the time of his life talking to some of these athletes, but they don't have the language for it. But often their language is because many of them are not born to intellectual families, and there's a lot of ethnicities, and there is a dominant section of the NFL and NBA happens to be black students. So they've never heard about Plotinus or the Upanishads or any of this, but they're having these experiences. Right. And the coaches try to talk them out of their metaphors. This is a standard because, it's brilliant, Paul. I'm thinking of this super athlete. Anyway, that's a brilliant metaphor. I know it's a metaphor because you're taking it literally. And, this one guy did a catch in one of the Super Bowls. It's just incredible. And, but he said, well, I have 7 fingers. When you've got 7 fingers, you use them. And so the dialogue goes, oh, no, okay, now look, Paul, here's a film. Obviously, you don't have 7 fingers. And he says to them, essentially the same thing I should have been saying to my professors at Stanford. Well, you don't have 7. But during that game, I had 7. And he kept saying that. They said, well, okay. And then he leaves. And then they say to one another, wow, well, he's so good. We'll let him have his metaphors,
It reminds me when I was in a really bad car accident many years ago, and my hand was all bashed up and operated on, and I couldn't play the harp for several weeks or months. And finally, when I was playing again, the left hand was stiff enough. But I wanted to do this recording. I had the music written and everything, but I hadn't been able to play this one passage I'd written, even in all the times I'd practiced. I go into the recording studio. I had never done it because my hand was still not healed completely. And in that moment, the consciousness changes and I visualize doing it, and I did it.
Wow.
It all came out of what you're talking about. You visualize it, you make it happen. I didn't have 7 fingers, but I visualized the fingers working in a way they weren't able to work yet.
Well, I tell you, it's everywhere. I lately had a dalliance with the San Francisco Symphony, and one of the prime players, a cellist there, invited me in, and so I got to meet with 8 or 10 of the players. It's just as with the athletes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what reminds me.
There it is again. There it is again. I couldn't believe it. And how full, but I've never read a music critic describing these experiences like this in the San Francisco Chronicle about the symphony. It's a story that does not yet get told.
You're right.
As from a realist position.
Yeah.
And with enough sophistication not to have to make up crazy stories, although the stories they make up are realistic. And somebody's going to write a tremendous novel, probably about a.
Where's your next book?
Well, anyway, I've got. Well, anyway, I could.
You could, and you might. I wanted to see if anyone wants to ask questions. This has been so riveting, really, Mike. But I'm looking to see if anyone. Yeah, okay, Ben, I see you. You can unmute.
Yeah, I responded very much to Michael's description of the sneering attitude in the academic philosophy departments. I discovered while I was studying philosophy as an undergraduate at the University of Arizona back in the late 60s and early 70s, the whole rage there was most of the department, I discovered to my dismay, were logical positivists, which was a branch of analytic philosophy.
Wow.
And I lost probably 100 matches against these intellectually, more trained, professors. And I came up with relatively the same argument. It's like, your empiricism depends on measurable. So if you have to have an instrument,
Yeah.
my instrument is my consciousness. You can measure a spectrometer or an audiometer or whatever, but there's other kinds of instruments. And that was my best argument, but I got beaten repeatedly on that. And the joke with my one professor that was a continental professor was, he said, these guys would come to the lecture in a lab coat if they could get away with it. So that I survived that, but it has kind of given me a chip on my shoulder intellectually. It's like, I am ready to deal with being sneered at.
You've got an army with you, I'll tell you. I mean, it's gathering, and it's, well, good for you. Are you did philosophy figure in your life later?
Well, yeah, I ended up spending most of my 20s living in yoga ashrams and meditation centers. I studied Vajrayana Buddhism, and I still practice occasionally with the local Shambhala Center. But yeah, I have a lifelong meditation practice out of that encounter, which was a strength.
Oh, well, good for you. I mean, well, that was such a rich, deep vein. All of the Buddhisms that came in, it was very heavy at Esalen, the Buddhist influence. Yet actually, I'd have to say it won out over when I tried to bring in more Christian influence. And of course, there was an awful lot of Jewish folks within Esalen. I mean, the leading professors like Abe Maslow and all. But typically, our Jewish community would be like J Street to the left, not Orthodox and not with doctrine heavy, and the same with Christianity. And the little bit we've had at Esalen that you would have to say Islamic, but it's the Sufis, not the Ayatollahs. And so to the degree we have been influenced by and have embodied these religious traditions, it's had to be very light on the theology. And so with Buddhism, you had the natural advantage, particularly with the Zen tradition, and with the Theravada, the Southern Buddhism, like Jack Kornfield, if you know his work, and it's super light on the metaphysics. I mean, and often humorous and koans and so forth. So it's rooted heavily in practice. But I love it that you had 100 fights. Oh boy, they were in their heyday back then. The reductionists, they were in their heyday, and it's kind of worn off. But scientism, and of course the massive success of mainstream science, obviously, but with it has come this reductionism as well, and that's been a big item at Esalen too. That would be another subject, Georgia.
We should have a whole course, Mike.
Well, I mean,
we could do a whole course. This is very exciting. It's one of the more exciting programs we've ever had, in my mind.
Well,
yeah, really, really good.
Any other questions?
Well, that's what I'm looking for. Anyone else have a question? They're just mesmerized, I think. You have, oh, here comes one. Katie. Katie, you want
Yeah,
to?
hi, Michael. It's really a thrill to listen to you and be here. I was influenced, of course, in the beginning years with Will Schutz's work, and that changed my life. Boy, I do wish you'd write this next book and do a composite. I like the title. What was it you said? The Rumble in the Hood.
Yes.
And I'd love to see a composite of the great, what you believe helped you transcend most or could help us move to the unified field. But that's not my question. Here's my question. So, what would you say is the single most important element in your vision or your values that made it possible for Esalen to have such a continuity of purpose and sustainability in its endeavor? Because I ask that because we're going into times we're going to be having to do more group work in politics.
Well, Katie, thanks for that. I get asked that question a lot, and I have to resist the impulse to say one single thing. It's there's so many different reasons why we have gone on. We were heavily imitated right from the get-go. I mean, really, from the mid-'60s. At one point, there were about 100 growth centers in the U.S., and there was a meeting in San Francisco of 75 of these centers in 1969 and another one in 1970. All right. But most of them are not there. Why? It's a rotten business model. I mean, and so people come up to say now they want to start a center. So this happens quite a bit. And to do it, it's a lot of work. And I think that how this is being carried forward is with a wide variety of formats that have not yet been fully described by any historian, sociologist, or anthropology. That's why it's a huge underground movement. Now, you can look back in history and see the birth of this. Let's say in the birth of Christianity itself, which came out of Judaism. All right. But the Desert Fathers, in Egypt, and then all over the place, the seeds were being planted in all sorts of forms. And then when it exploded up to the surface, and under the leadership of in Europe of the Vatican, in Rome, and when Charlemagne marched across Europe and bowed down to the Pope. Now, that was 800, but by then it had 400 years, 500 years. It coalesced. All right. You can look today and see these coalescences happening around. Nobody can predict how this thing's going to take shape. But I think, first of all, you need to have, what people want are circles of practice, and what hopefully they can stay open and not form a cult, because these cults can be awful. So that's why we had this thing, no one captures the flag. It's to keep the system open, but keep the community intact. You see what I mean? So that marriage of that, and we had the advantage of having that property, and that was lucky, and my family was very generous. And but we we probably have the longest history in the book of Guinness Book of Records on organizational incompetence. I mean, we made every single mistake that was being made and being glamorized in the 60s, the glamorization of ineptitude. And a lot of words you couldn't use. You may not believe this, but to say that awful word, Money, and to say it Money? I was scolded on various occasions. You just said money. I said, yes, I said money. What do you want me to say? Wampum? And it's hilarious. I'm kind of writing my own little satire of early Esalen. So now, in the steps we take now to blossom, they're happening in all sorts of ways. And people are experimenting. And it's largely, I would argue strongly that some of it is described. The Gallup poll talks about, spiritual but not religious, and so forth. But like last week, 2 weekends ago, the stories I heard were mind-boggling that I've never heard of people trying to launch into this greater life that we harbor. So you need what the answer I give when people come to me want to start these centers. There's a certain number of things you must have, and if you don't, you're not going to last. You're not going to last. You have to have certain things. You have to keep an open system alongside this fire that's burning in you, and these methods you're learning. And Georgia, you learned clairvoyance right away. So a lot of these things you can learn them, but then to keep them alive, it's hard. And I speak from experience. I'm 94, 95. I mean, the failure rate to success is about 10 to 1 in terms of my personal practice. It's some things work for me, some things don't. But if you can find community of practice, and if you can have it sufficiently rich and have both vision and experience wedded together, then you got a better chance.
Yeah, this has been extraordinary, Mike. Just really an incredible hour. I'm not going to keep you longer because you must be running out of voice at this point, but it's really been rich. And I'd love to follow up another time with you also to do this.
Well, it's good to see you guys, all of you. I love it that you had this fight, Ben, with that professor. He got 100 shots at you. Well, that's about the way it worked then.
Well, when I almost left music as a major, I was going to go into philosophy. And when I saw what they were teaching in philosophy, I thought, oh, that's not the philosophy I want to learn. I wanted to learn the Eastern philosophy because we had a class that dealt with ancient philosophy, and we learned Indian and Hinduism. And I thought, this is what I want to learn. But they didn't teach that after the introductory course.
No. I mean,
That was the end of that.
If you were going to be like me and try to get a PhD in philosophy, logical positivism is not good for you.
No.
Your brain has to take things and dissect them, and I think it's physically bad for you. I mean, and if there's any truth to the idea, I think there is, that the brain divides up the left brain and the right brain. And you got this overgrown left brain, so to speak. Now they're finding out the range of neuroses that OCD, and then it gets misdiagnosed as a kind of middle-age autism. And there's all sorts of labels for the brain damage of people who are using their brain wrong. Seriously. I had in one test at Stanford when I was doing the work at that point I was 23, 24 years old by then. And I had an anxiety that I couldn't name happening while I was taking the test. And in a very real sense, I lost my mind. Mm-hmm. And when I walked out of the classroom, I had to navigate around until I could get on 2 feet. It was scary. I was all in trying. It's just that, and through the history of Esalen, we've learned something about, Abe Maslow helped teach us about the neurological disorders caused by your mental practices, and sometimes they're religious practices. And that there's been quite a history of that in severe Zen practice. You're sitting these sessions and you're focusing, and that's why it's better to have a good meditation teacher if you're going to go real deep, because sometimes that brain can take over and it can do things. So oh God, we got a long way to go as a culture, I'll tell you.
Yeah, we sure do. Yes, and we know even more today how far we have to go and how far the culture has regressed. But this is inspiring, Mike, really inspiring today. And I'm definitely going to want to do another one with you sometime in the near
Okay.
future.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mike. You'll get the recording tonight.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us. I'm going to stop the recording.